Sketch markers filled with an alcohol-based ink are a great tool for the drawing artist, but they also present their own unique challenges. In this video, I'm using Copic alcohol-based sketch markers, and I am using exclusively the brush end because that's the end that I use in my artwork. But it hasn't necessarily always been an easy journey with them. So in this video, I want to show you 3 tips that I've learned by using them over and over again. Is it worth the effort? We have a charming line drawing of a street scene in Paris. Does it really need tone? I think tone can really make it come to life. Or with a very different street scene in London with a great dramatic perspective. Does tone really add anything more? Tone can bring a great three-dimensionality to what otherwise can be a bit of a flat drawing. Tone can clarify all these things at a glance for us. Why would we want to risk messing up this beautiful line drawing looking out over the grand staircase in the Vienna State Opera House? How about a totally transforming sense of visual drama? A perfect match for the theatrical drama of the architecture and in fact the purpose of the building. Or if we zoom right out with our subject, looking over the front towers of St. Paul's Cathedral, what more would tone add to this? How about a very strong sense of depth, of a foreground which is close and in sharp view, and a distance that drifts off further and further into the background? And finally, back at the Vienna State Opera House, but this time looking up into the beautiful ceiling, there's a great sense of view, of perspective. Wouldn't we be risking confusion if we started to introduce tone to it? And yet tone can strengthen all the good qualities in a scene of a line drawing. It can increase the depth of vision going backwards, and we can also manipulate it to push high other parts of the same scene, and in so doing create a further distance between 2 points within the same drawing than we felt without the tone. Tone introduces so many great possibilities for the drawing artist that it's a shame not to at least sometimes use it. But it can be a tricky medium to manipulate, and it can certainly bring its own tears as well as joys, which is why I want to share these 3 tips that I've learned through my experience. Sketch markers are not paint, and so they can't be blended in the same way as paint, and yet there is an ability to blend them to some degree. So let me show you my first tip, what I've learned as the best way to blend sketch markers. And I'm going to use the 6 lowest grades of neutral grade tone to show you. If you're wanting to do a blend of tones, start with the darkest tone so that you're bringing lighter tones over the top of the darker tone. I get N5, N for neutral grey, not N for number. And I go just a little bit lighter with pressure when I get towards the end of where I want to go. Now I get N4, which is the next lightest tone, but I start some way back so that I'm doing a healthy overlap, and I start lightly and then I increase my pressure slightly. So now I'll get N4, which is the next lightest tone, but I'm going to do a healthy overlap, and I will start with a lighter touch and then slowly increase it as I get to where the paper is. There are 2 ways we can seek to make this effect lighter. We can go slower, which allows more ink to transfer, and we can use greater or less pressure. So now I'm going to get N3 and do the same thing. These dry lighter than they look when you first put them on. Now I get N2, N1. We end with N0, which is the lightest value of the neutral grey. And afterwards, it's always possible to make a few adjustments. So I'm just darkening parts of this N3, parts of this N2, and the M5. I have found this is the best way if I want to get a nice blend of my inks. One thing to bear in mind is that the different inks photograph differently. And so what I'm seeing in life is actually a smoother gradation of tones than what I see looking through the camera. Now, this works nicely when there's tape on both sides and we don't have to be careful about edges. If in our drawing it's important to have a straight edge, putting some tape on while we're drawing can be a helpful thing, but it's not always possible to use tape when we want to get a gradating effect with our ink. But we can't always use tape. One of the problems if I'm trying to use the sketch marker between two lines is that invariably I'm moving my line slower either when I'm starting or when I'm approaching the end of my line. And the rule is that the longer the brush nib is in contact with the paper, the more ink will flow onto the paper. And so when I'm pausing or when I'm going slower, there's more ink being deposited. And you can see, in fact, that as the ink dries, it becomes more obvious when the area of paper which has the least ink deposited on it, because I'm moving quickly across that part, dries. It's relatively lighter. And it's the same with the other tones. And if we try and go faster to minimize this effect, we become less accurate with actually stopping at our lines and overlapping onto parts of the paper which I want to keep white. So my second tip is in addressing this situation. So part of the solution lies in understanding how the brush marker works. I need to minimize the time it spends in the one place because more ink is deposited. So what I've learned to do in this situation is I do some very light, quick lines, bordering the edges, and then do the infill in both directions. And now I know that I'm still going to have some additional ink deposited on the edges, and so I compensate for that by putting additional ink in the center. But then I basically follow the same principles I followed when I used the tape. And of course I move with as even a speed as I can. And there's the N4. And so now my N3. N2. And N0. And so now we have the freehand equivalent of this. My third tip involves a problem that I very often see my drawing students have. Quite often, you want to have a thin strip of white with very dark tone on each side. And it's often a very important part of the drawing. And one danger with sketch markers is we can very easily cover up parts that we want to preserve. Just watch me with this. I'm going to very carefully come along this line on both sides. However, already the gap is looking, to me, noticeably wobbly. It's also thinner than I drew it. And the reason is because the ink is bleeding into the paper. And although I applied this tone very carefully right on the edge of the line, after I'd moved the pen past, the ink that was in the paper was still flowing through the fibers of the paper across the line. And it's happening more in some areas than others. And those areas are the areas where I actually went more carefully, ironically. And because I went more carefully, I slowed down. And because I slowed down, more ink was coming out. And because my pen was already on the line, then the surplus ink could only flow past the line. So how do we stop this happening and yet still create these nice thin lines? I found the best solution is to border these lines with a very thin, quick line that is the lightest I can do. And then when I do the tone up against it, I don't actually go right onto the line. I stay back. And I know the ink will bleed into this lighter ink, but I can do this darker line much more quickly now because I'm not trying to keep an edge to it. So there's less extra ink just bleeding through the paper. And if I do this on the other side, These lines were the same distance apart. I never took the tip of my brush marker over the line on either of these two lines, but as you can see, I have a much more successful second attempt because the technique I used didn't deposit nearly as much ink nearly as closely to the line. The other thing worth knowing in connection to this is that different papers absorb ink at different rates. So it's always helpful to test the particular paper that you're going to use with sketch markers and just get a feel for how much the ink sits on the top and how much it soaks into the paper. The general rule is the heavier the paper and the smoother the surface, the less bleeding will take place. This is normal A4 for use in printing. And the Copic sketch markers bleed more in this paper than they do using my 210 GSM drawing cartridge, which is my standard paper that I use for my drawings. So pay attention to the paper you use and always test out before you use new paper, your fine liners and your markers to see how they behave on that particular paper. Sketch markers bring wonderful possibilities to our drawings, but it's incredibly helpful to learn how they work and to learn to control that so that we can make sure the tone is where we want it. G'day, I'm Travers. I was very hesitant when I first began using tone in my drawings, but I got to admit I'm a great fan now of how quickly they can transform our line work into something that really goes beyond. The hardest thing, if we've done a lovely line drawing, is not to be afraid that we're going to spoil it with our sketch markers. Hey, it could happen, but we will never progress our art if we can't go past the level of our fears. So risk it. One thought is you could do a nice line drawing, photograph it, print off some copies, and then use them to practice with your tone. You've got nothing to lose that way, and you can be really adventurous with how you try out tonal possibilities. However you do it, have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.